Welcome to Pop and Lock. I'm Landry Ayers.
And I'm Natalie Dowzicki.
Joining us today to discuss Christopher Nolan's treatment of the Caped Crusader, the Dark Knight, the one and only Batman, is fellow at the Center for a Stateless Society, Corey Massimino.
Hey, everyone.
And research fellow in the Cato Institute's Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies, editor-in-chief of the Cato Supreme Court Review, and co-host of libertarianism.org's own podcast, Free Thoughts, the one, the only, Trevor Burrus.
Thanks for having me.
So, Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy is set in a world that's not all that different from ours. Criminal activity is high and corruption is obviously rampant in Gotham, and Bruce Wayne wants to fix that in a seemingly, let's call it, noble way. But my question for everyone is Batman even really a hero? Can vigilantes be heroes?
Yeah, I think that's probably the question at the center of those movies that Nolan is exploring, if anything. And I get, probably like most good movies, I'm not sure that we get a definitive answer either way. I think that it's really explored in the second one, in The Dark Knight. You know, that movie closes with Gordon, his monologue, and he says Batman's not a hero. He's something more, you know. So it seems like by the end of that movie, we're not supposed to think he's a hero, but does that imply he's a villain? It seems like maybe he's transcending that dichotomy. Nolan tends to be pretty philosophical in his movies, while not with overt philosophical references like The Matrix or anything, but just in his themes and ideas and structure. You know, it seems to me, because his movies, especially The Dark Knight, are influenced by The Dark Knight Returns, the Frank Miller comic book from the 80s. And in that one, there's similar overtones of Batman kind of being above these categories in some way, like a Nietzschean Overman or a Superman, and going over above the categories of good and evil, that the morals of society, and becoming something greater. So it seems to me that that's kind of what he's trying to explore with the character. I mean, whether that's a correct take on what a vigilante would be like, you know, I mean, I think that's kind of an interesting question.
I think that as just a general category, vigilantes can absolutely be heroes. To say that they can't, depending on how we define vigilante, is to sort of endorse the state. If we're defining vigilante as some sort of extra state actor, obviously, if you are living in a corrupt state, if you're living in a state that has no semblance of morality, and we could talk about what that is, like that there's maybe there's no state from an anarchist perspective that has any moral justification. But if you're living in a state, let's just postulate, you know, Nazi Germany, becoming a vigilante against Nazi Germany, acting outside of the state, is clearly morally justified. Say the people who tried to assassinate Hitler, for example, or trying to hide Jews. So Oskar Schindler is a vigilante in some sense. Now, if Batman goes out there and fights crime in what he views as a fallen and corrupt city, I think the really interesting thing about Nolan's Batman is that he is actually he operates within the state in a very strange way. He works with the police, right? He works with Commissioner Gordon. He believes in due process, which we could talk about. You know, not all vigilantism is justified. There's both the thing you're fighting against. If the state is corrupt and it's immoral, then you can legitimately fight against it. This is like Jay Brennan's When All Else Fails book to some extent, which is an episode of Free Thoughts in the past. You can legitimately resist the state. Everyone should believe that, unless you think the state is some sort of omnipotent, all good force. But the second thing is, how do you have to do that? So when Bruce Wayne refuses to execute the prisoner in Batman Begins, as on some sort of theory of due process, that he's not an executioner, that he has a moral code that can be used to justify his actions to himself, but I also think to other people, that due process is a meaningful moral concept even outside of the state. When you pass judgment on someone, If you just say in a social situation and you think someone stepped on your foot intentionally and then you decide to punch them out, as opposed to assessing the evidence and seeing whether or not they stepped on your foot accidentally, that's a moral requisite of being someone who acts outside of the state. But again, going back to what I said, I think rewatching the movies, it was struck me how much Batman is working with the state and trying to make the state better, and especially the police, qua the police.
Well, that was interesting that you say that, Trevor, because that moment stuck out to me as well when he refuses to execute the murderer with Ra's al Ghul and the League of Shadows when they're in Bhutan at the beginning, and they don't really explain. He just went to Bhutan after.
Wait, do we know it's Bhutan?
I looked it up.
Okay,
and
we were
apparently,
talking about this with my roommates. I'm like, where is this?
Because I thought it was Nepal at one point, and somebody else thought it was somewhere else. But I looked it up. I don't know if it confirms in the movie diegetically, but apparently in the plot of the movie, it is confirmed that it is in Bhutan, but. He just before this, so the sort of path he's taken to get to that point was he goes to Mr. Chill, the man that killed his parents and shot them dead in the street in cold blood. He goes to his parole hearing, and it is revealed that he had plans and was about to murder this man after he leaves the hearing, but someone with ties to the Falcone crime syndicate beats him to it. And he's talking with Rachel as they're driving away, and she's sort of talking about how there needs to be a system of due process and that these people will go to trial and that crime will sort of eventually justice will be served that way. And he says that the system is broken. And then between that and going to the crime hideout and then going to Bhutan and getting sent to prison and getting beat up by all these people and joining the League of Shadows, he suddenly defines, he's like, no, he needs due process. What changed in that small trajectory relative to the rest of the film that made him believe that due process was justified and worthy? I never understood that.
Oh, I think is exactly what I said. Due process is not just a governmental state concept. It's a concept of fairness that exists outside of the state. If you're going to pass judgment, meaning somehow put punishment on someone, the question of what it's the oldest question in justice, right? It actually is. But, well, not the oldest, but you go to Hobbes and Locke. You go to state of nature. In Locke's state of nature, there's two types of state of natures. Basically, this is something Randy Barnett told me one time when I was an intern, and I've thought about it ever since, that there are two types of people, generally, Hobbesians and Lockeans. Hobbesians think that without the state, everything is chaos and just like the Thunderdome, and everyone is fighting each other all the time. Lockeans think that without the state, things are generally cooperative. Like most things kind of work, except for some things that you can't do. And the biggest one for Locke is that there's no impartial judge, that no one can be the judge in their own case. And so you need someone to referee a dispute between two people, both of whom have an interest in the dispute. So the very concept of we need a third party who is disinterested in this to referee the dispute, that's Locke's first justification for the state. And that is some sense of due process, right? Like no one should be a judge in their own case. And I think that that's exactly where Batman is coming from, in that the state apparatus in Gotham does not give due process under any conception of it. And when he is asked to execute the person, he is not able to assess whether or not due process as a non-state concept has been given to this prisoner that he's supposed to execute.
It's kind of difficult to reconcile those two concepts together, because on one hand, he's saying that ostensibly saying that the state is corrupt and those who are trying to carry out due process aren't doing it. And he questions the authority the state has. But then on the other hand, he's very he's working with the police and very almost trusting of them and their motives, and they're collaborating to some extent. So I think it's kind of hard for me to see, like, he agrees that the state is corrupt and it's not giving due process and all of what we've just been talking about, but then agrees to work with representatives of the state. So I guess that's like one thing that's difficult to reconcile throughout all three of the movies, not just the Batman Begins.
So going back to the issue of Bruce's arc and his motivation in Batman Begins, to where he goes from wanting to kill Joe Chill and then he doesn't want to kill the murderer. I don't know if maybe I'm more pessimistic. I don't know if I interpret all this as a defense of due process, even non-state due process, which I agree that's not like a contradiction or impossible. But to me, like, the key moment is, or the key line is, if I recall correctly, Rachel tells Bruce that his dad would be ashamed of him. And to me, that's the key line, because in a lot of ways, Batman Begins is, I think, about fatherhood and fathers in general. There's competing father figures for Bruce. There's Alfred, Lucius, and then Ra's as well, who he must kind of grow out of, I guess. And so to me, it seems kind of rooted in character and rooted in that needing to essentially make his father proud after he's dead and do justice by that. And that kind of comes to fruition at the very end of the film when he decides, I'm going to rebuild Wayne Manor brick for brick, just like it was. And so the reason I'm pessimistic about the due process explanation is because, I mean, he has a no-kill rule, 100%. He has this very clear, strict line that he won't kill. Now, we could get into, like, what happens with him and Ra's at the end of Batman Begins. That's a huge swamp of moral responsibility questions. But, like, in just terms of due process, in Batman Begins, he also enters the premises of those random people who live in Gotham searching their place for drugs, for instance. And then in The Dark Knight, everything really escalates. And to me, I mean, that movie, if anything, is challenging this idea of to what extent we can maintain due process in the face of, like, an existential threat to social order that the Joker represents. Because, he beats him up in the interrogation scene with, certainly illegal tactics there and quite brutal. And then the surveillance at the end. So it seems like certainly due process is not, at least by that point, not the clear moral line the killing he sticks with, I think, but I don't know about due process.
I think that, Corey's pointed out something super interesting watching these again in the past few days. Actually, to be honest, I watched all of them yesterday in a row. But they're extremely post 9/11 movies.
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
Absolutely.
And the question of torture, for example, or enhanced interrogation, if we want to call it, when it is justified, and also the question of chaos. And this was actually interesting because Barack Obama, in some speech he gave regarding terrorism, he actually used the "some men just want to watch the world burn" line. And this concept of evil. And I think this is like a really interesting overriding theme in these movies. The concept of criminality is extremely reactionary and right wing. That criminality is a choice you make, and you deserve all the opprobrium you can possibly put on you. Like, criminals are outsiders. Ra's al Ghul says this all the time in the first movie. But the fact that they're just people for no reason who want to just break things down and watch the world burn. And that, is a concept that was very prevalent in post 9/11 America, that we didn't really try to understand Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. We just sort of assumed that there are a bunch of people out there who, even though they claim to have an ideology, mostly just want to burn things down. And then you have this question of, well, what do you do in response to those people? Do they deserve due process? Or can we beat them up to learn about, what their plans are? And it just, the movie teams with that, but ultimately I think it's quite reactionary.
I agree, Trevor, with a lot of that. I think that what you're talking about is kind of a way in which the Joker he's less of an anarchist in the sense of having any actual theory of social or political order.
Oh, he's more like an anarchist in the classic, in the like
yes,
daily sense of the in the incorrect, like meaning.
I think a more pejorative kind of comment. Every day certainly gets used as well. But I think a more accurate term would be nihilist. And I think those terms, now there are plenty of anarchists who are nihilists, but not necessarily, and many aren't. So, but I think they get equated, and that's kind of his ideology. I think in that movie, his whole character is sort of based around this lack of ability to take responsibility for his actions. He tells Dent that it wasn't his fault Rachel died. He's just a dog chasing cars. It was Gordon and Batman's fault. And by the end, that comes to its ultimate fruition in Dent, who elides responsibility with flipping the coin. And that I thought was a really clever way to create some sort of sensible rationale, as much as you can, at least, for a silly comic book thing as flipping a coin to make your choices. But it becomes this very like existentialist tale when Nolan tells it, because Dent and Joker, and this goes to what you were saying, Trevor, about like criminals who want to watch the world burn for no reason. In some way, the Joker might be that, but there's interesting things to speculate about what his past might truly have been, although he misleads us. But with Dent, we know that he is motivated, by this, this kind of tortured soul because his loved one was murdered, and he feels like he has nothing to live for. He feels like the world is inherently unfair and absurd and unjust. And so, by the end, he's just, the coin has become his moral compass, not him. And Batman says, shoot who's responsible. And he's talking about himself, because he is responsible for Rachel's death. He could have saved her if he wasn't. That's the kind of contradiction of that scene in the middle of the movie when Joker tells him to address us backwards, because Batman tries to save Rachel, and in that he's being selfish because the city needs Dent more. But the Joker tricked him, so then he ends up not saving Rachel and saving Dent. And so it's this horrible karmic injustice. And by the end, he's the one, realizing that like responsibility is like this key thing that I'm supposed to take on in the world, and the Joker and Dent like don't.
One thing that struck me that's kind of dovetailing on the end of this discussion is you cannot be a vigilante, going back to Natalie's original question, without a theory of crime. It would be like if you took some very, very Marxist, extremely social causation theory of crime and said that all criminals are a product of their environment, and that crime is the natural result of, say, hunger and need and inequality or whatever, then it'd be
which they do say in this movie. They talk about the fallout of this economic depression that that Bruce Wayne's father helped write, and eventually they tried to correct. But that they definitely hint at that within the movie. Yeah,
it's a theme I just want to point out, like as you said, Landry, and then also when Bruce becomes a criminal, with the first time he steals for being hungry, right? So it's like, how would Jean Valjean fare in Batman's world, right? Would Batman just go and beat the crap out of him? Or does he need to be someone like the Joker, who doesn't actually have a reason for crime except for his own enjoyment? Or Bane, who's an ideologue? That's just some of the things that popped in my head watching them again.
So before I rewatched these, I had in my mind that I liked the second movie the best, partially because I think the Joker's character is the most interesting. And then Aaron and I got in a little debate because he thinks Batman Begins is the best. But anyway, that's another story. But I thought it would be interesting for us to compare the Joker and Bane and how they're different, or what kind of philosophies you think really help their character develop, and kind of just discuss what the difference is between Joker and Bane, and kind of maybe talk a little bit about their origin. I know we know more of Joker's origin than Bane's, but what do you guys think about the difference between the two villains?
Okay, first I want to ask you a question. Did you then come to the conclusion that the third movie is better than the second movie?
Yes. So I went in thinking the second movie was the best, because that's the one I clearly remembered, and I'd seen the most, and I'd seen different parts of it the most, and that kind of stuff. And I also thought the Joker was the most interesting, memorable villain. But then when I watched the third movie, I thought the pacing of that movie I liked better, if that makes sense. So there are different reasons I liked the movies.
I'm totally with you on this. This was a debate with my roommates who were having. It's what I the Dark Knight was better than I remember the last time I watched it, when its incoherency stuck out more to me. And then but I do think that I kind of reverse order them, and I don't think it's a huge gap. Like, I think that I would give like Dark Knight Rises a 9 and the Dark Knight an 8.5 and the Batman Begins like an 8. So I'm not saying that these are, it's head and shoulders, but I think exactly what you said, Natalie. I think that Bane's motivation and planning is more evident. And the weirdest thing about the Joker is, and there's an old YouTube video that made this comment where you just wonder how he gets this stuff done. Now, I know we're supposed to suspend disbelief when it comes to the Joker has always, and Corey's knowledge of Batman is deeper than mine. But like the Joker always, hatches schemes that end up working out. But like he's got lackeys who are like completely dependable and totally expendable, totally expendable. I don't know where he finds these people that is just like, okay, like you always get things done, right? Like imagine, you guys, Aaron's your boss, and you're totally dependable, Natalie, and then Aaron's also just willing to kill you, like let you be killed for like no reason, right? like it's just like, like no one would work for him. Like it's like, I know it's like a stupid complaint. I mean, we're supposed to suspend disbelief, but then it makes a lot more sense that the logistical problems of Dark Knight irk me more than the fact that Bane is planning something, pouring the concrete with explosives for months and months and months, and has people working for him. Ultimately, I mean, the Ledger performance is rightfully regarded as legendary, but I think Bane is more interesting in his own way.
I always thought that, and I don't know if this was on purpose, but I wondered if the sort of schism between what the Joker says he is and how he actually acts is sort of part of his act. Like he talks about chaos and being, out of disorder and the sort of anarchy influence that people always label him with. Whereas I wonder if he's smarter than like what the public in Gotham or even us as the audience sort of think of him as, if maybe he is much more conniving and has, all of these lackeys and plans and things that are sort of going in, and it's all part of the sort of, as Ra's al Ghul says in the very, very beginning of Batman Begins, he says theatricality and deception are powerful agents. And I wonder if there's a part of it that doesn't really get spoken of. And I wish, and I wonder if it's ever, if it was on purpose or if it really was an inconsistency in the filmmaking, that the Joker is supposed to represent someone that maybe the joke that he's playing is making us think that he's inducing chaos. Kind of like how all the villains do at some point in each of these movies, like when Ra's al Ghul sends all the Narrows into a panic with the panic-inducing hallucinogen, or with the Joker, or when they blow up all the bridges and pouring the concrete in Dark Knight Rises. I wonder if he's much more manipulative than people give him credit for, or if he really is something chaotic. And I don't know if that's something about Christopher Nolan's Joker, or if there's something about the Joker overall and his sort of mythos behind him.
Corey, I really want to hear your thoughts. Going back to that point, just exactly what Andrew said, which is I really was picturing like Joker org morning meetings, like just like, all right, guys, we're going to get together, like, and you need to make sure that you are at the police station on time, right? Like this, he's like, no,
make sure to clock in.
Hey, I'm the leader of this meeting.
There.
Yeah, clock in. I'm the leader of this meeting. Don't talk out of turn. Okay, you need to make sure you're here. You need to make sure, just like, you kind of picture that. I can picture that with Bane, but not Joker. But Corey has a deeper knowledge of Joker than I do.
Yeah, a deeper knowledge about the really important things in life are pop culture characters. I think.
Welcome to the show, Corey.
Yeah, that's why I love it here. Yeah, but yeah, the Joker is, I think, kind of so fascinating in that film. Landry, you started to touch on in what you were saying about how essentially Nolan uses the Joker as a foil for Batman because the Joker is also adopting the same kind of outward, not the same kind of outward persona, but the same means of developing this outward persona that scares others, intimidates others, builds him up in the eyes of others, and then eventually gets other people to do what he wants. And I think one kind of interesting way that Nolan tries to show this in the structure of the film, and maybe this is related to Trevor's complaint that the Joker's plans, like, we never see how he brings them about and realizes his plans. But I think that's kind of interesting in a way, because the Joker's presented to the audience in The Dark Knight the same way Batman would be viewed by criminals. They only see him, when he comes out of the night, when he comes out of the shadows and pounces on them. Like, they don't see him making plans. They don't see him organized. They don't see him making his suit or buying the Batmobile or anything. So the viewer is sort of seeing the Joker as the criminal sees Batman as the sort of omnipresent force, this almost force of nature that just exists in the city. And I think that's kind of a neat way to approach the character, because moreover, if we're talking about Joker historically, in my view, Joker historically he's almost always insane. He's almost always supposed to be insane. But to me, Nolan totally took a new twist on him and decided that the insanity is merely that mask that he wears, and that he's actually totally sane. I mean, Trevor, you joked about like these Joker orgs in the meeting about telling them, oh, you better get to the station on time. But we kind of see something almost reminiscent of that, because in the final sequence, and again, they don't really tell us this, but they show us, because in the final sequence, when Joker is explaining the scheme to the people on the ferry boats about how they have to blow each other up by midnight or whatever, he's reading off of note cards we see in the reflection in the mirror, which is so at odds with what we know, that persona of his that he's tried to show other people.
He has a speechwriter. Yes, he has a speechwriter.
That's funny. Yeah. And I think it's interesting. Like, that is like that one shot is like a key insight into the Joker's mentality. Like, he's not insane like the character traditionally has been. He just is an ideologue, like Batman. His ideology is just nihilism. Like, he's not confused or insane about it. If he stood trial, I don't think that Nolan would have him evade responsibility for his actions, because that's, going back to what I said earlier about the whole point of that movie is this kind of existentialist notion of responsibility. And so that's why he turned the Joker from an insane character into a sane nihilist, I think.
To me, Bane seems more of like a methodical evil, and the Joker seems more like a catastrophic evil, in the sense that, like, I don't think either of them are, obviously both of them are evil, and both of them, I think in both movies, I could be wrong though, are at some point are referred to as terrorists, which is like, again, harking back to what Trevor said earlier about these movies being very evidently post 9/11. And I think what always puts me off about Bane is his voice. So I don't know if you all noticed this, but I think with the Joker, he sounds insane.
My voice, you say.
Yeah, Bane's voice like doesn't match. I don't know if you guys feel this way. It doesn't match his actions. Like it's, but that makes it almost creepier. I don't know. Maybe that's just how way Christopher Nolan is trying to portray Bane. But I just think the voice does not match up with like what is being said, which I think makes it even more his character even more interesting, because it's like, it's almost, his voice is kind of jovial in a way.
He sounds like an aristocrat.
Confusing.
That's the thing. He sounds like the headmaster of like
that's hilarious.
Like a British school. Like, well, you people need to know
exactly
that you children cannot play in the yard today. Like,
Headmaster Bane. Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. He's aristocratic. He's sophisticated.
That's a great irony I never thought of, Trevor, because I mean, that's definitely true. I mean, on The Dark Knight, I haven't said anything about The Dark Knight Rises really, but to me, that movie is like two movies mashed together. It's like half a movie about this dude with like depression and shit, and like getting through that, and then it's a movie about like the French Revolution and like a failed state, and like somehow it's both, and for better or worse. There's a really funny layer of irony to that, because Batman himself was inspired by the Scarlet Pimpernel in part, a hero associated with the French Revolution and saving aristocrats. So it's kind of, I don't know if that was intentional by Nolan.
It is
funny.
It is. I looked it up.
That's intentional.
Nolan was reticent to make a third movie because after Ledger's death, the intent was for the Joker to come back for the third movie, and he was reticent to do it. And then until they came up with a character that he thought was going to be the very opposite of the Joker, which Bane is to some extent. But he cites one of his biggest influences as A Tale of Two Cities, and that is very evident in the eulogy that Jim Gordon gives to Bruce Wayne, where he actually uses the Tale of Two Cities. You know, it is a far, far better thing I do than I have ever done. Like that is like from Tale of Two Cities. And I think that Bane's aristocratic nature is meant to play into those themes of the French Revolution.
What does Nolan's Batman do differently than the other Batmen? What made it stand out, either from a tonal aspect or from how it changed his origins, or what he represented? What made Christopher Nolan's Batman something that generally was deemed much more successful than, say, the Batman movies of the decades before, as much as I enjoy the ones with George Clooney? What do you think gave them the critical acclaim and sort of popularity and allowed him to have a resurgence in audiences' minds and hearts?
Yeah, I love the George Clooney Batman. We should definitely talk about Batman and Robin. But yeah, that's a great question. I think maybe it was just the right time and place. And, you know, like you said, post 9/11 take on the character. Pretty much every villain in the movies are a terrorist of sorts. The League of League of Assassins, I think. It's League of Shadows in the comics. I mixed it up.
Yeah,
but he changed to League of Assassins.
I think they're League of Shadows. Yeah.
But you know, they are effectively a terrorist organization. See, you know, he says that we sacked Rome, we burned London to the ground. Now we're going to try to destroy Gotham. So they're destroying, you know, these hallmarks of what we would usually call Western civilization. And then certainly the Joker is a terrorist, and I think Natalie pointed out Bane also gets called a terrorist. And turning Batman into this sort of, it's almost like sins of the father, like he's not, like, yeah, I mean, this is what we started talking about. Like, he's not the hero. He's not a hero in the conventional sense. You know, if anything, he's the best villain of the trilogy, right? Like, he's like constantly, he's his own worst enemy, certainly. And we could certainly argue he makes some critical mistakes when he pursues to Rachel over Dent, gets her killed, when he lies about Dent at the end of The Dark Knight and it comes home to roost in the next movie. You know, so I just think it was the right time and place. It was, you know, the culture wanted something this gritty and real, and it's interesting because it sort of inaugurated a decade where the superhero movie was dominant, and we saw a lot of people like trying to copy. I think maybe that's a little, you know, but to some extent really inspired by that gritty, realistic tone, and certainly didn't seem to be as successful as Nolan was.
It is interesting that Batman has had this life cycle of in the 50s and of course the 60s show with Adam West, like Batman is cheesy and more kind of stereotypically a superhero. And as Corey pointed out, the big change is with Frank Miller in the 80s and The Dark Knight Returns, where he establishes this realism. And I think that trajectory it's similar to a lot of things in pop culture, where there's let's say music, there's an idea of pomp and circumstance. Say, take someone like Elton John, who has these huge shows with all these costumes. And then there's the idea of punk rock, which is like more authentic, and you're playing in the small clubs, and that you need to sort of be in touch with that more authentic part of yourself. And I think a lot of people started thinking, what would actually make a human being do this? What would make a human being put on a costume and fight crime? Because that is not a psychologically okay thing to do for most people. And then exploring the ramifications of that, I think, and as Corey pointed out, it was the right time. I mean, so 2005 when Batman Begins comes out, there's no Marvel Cinematic Universe. There's the Spider-Man movies. There's the X-Men movies and the old Batman and the old Superman movies. Basically, that's all of the superhero movies that exist at that time. So that's why Batman Begins in particular was a revelation.
Yeah, and you could argue with the MCU, you could argue that, I mean, you might not get the MCU. I think Jon Favreau, the director of Iron Man, said he was certainly taken in by the realism of Batman Begins, and the first Iron Man really has a similar, not nearly as dark or gritty, but a similar sense of realism and grounded in terms of tone.
I think it's interesting to see the sort of dialectic between realism and escapism in things like superhero movies kind of push and pull over time, because obviously as stuff like the Marvel movies have grown and, you know, become so successful and huge, and some people would call bloated, I personally, you know, at a certain point had to just sort of stop. But I'm also not the biggest Marvel person when it comes to like the Avengers in general. I like, you know, certain superheroes and things like that. But then you go all the way over, and sometimes I'm like, Batman, you need to lighten up. You're a comic book. Like you were a comic book. You got to remember that. Like at some point, I need a holy something in there just to sort of remind me where we were coming from.
Bat shark repellent.
I kind of like, and I think that's one reason that I think maybe the George Clooney Batman maybe just didn't arrive at the right time, is because it's just so wacky and comic booky that I don't know if people really appreciated it for when it came out. And I think now there might be, specifically probably within, you know, the realm with the internet having become as big of a place as it is. Not that it wasn't around when that movie came out, but I think maybe it would be received by an audience that wanted that type of superhero movie a little bit more now. So I'm just very interested to see how that dialectic plays out over the next, you know, decade, 2 decades or so, to see which kind of direction things get started to pull in.
I mean, Corey is a fan, right? He's a fan of the Clooney movies, or the
yeah.
Clooney
Well, there's
movie.
one. The Clooney movie, and then Kilmer in the other one. Yeah, I mean, I could talk for a while about. I think those are underrated, and they came out at the
Which
wrong
one has
time.
bat nipples? Is that
Both.
Clooney
I thought both. Like,
do both have bat nipples? Okay,
at least the Clooney one.
Okay.
But
Yeah, definitely the Clooney one. You get the swooping shot in before. Yeah,
yeah, that those movies I think would. I mean, this, you know, we should mention the trailer for the new Robert Pattinson Batman movie, you know, dropped a couple weeks ago, I guess. You know, and it's certainly the case that they are, you know, continuing this route of a more Nolan-like Batman, this kind of guy with quite severe anger issues in a sense, and takes it out on criminals. They're going that route over the escapism, lighthearted 50s comic book stuff, which Schumacher was inspired by with Batman and Robin. That's what he was going for. So.
Yeah, I was just going to say, too, that what struck me with the Nolan trilogy is that Batman goes through some very, like, real human experiences and emotions, stuff like trauma and fear. And especially when it comes to Dark Knight Rises, this whole idea of, like, well, rising, but, like, rising above yourself and, like, being able to come back from, like, suppression and stuff like that. And I think those are all very real, very deep topics. And I haven't seen the George Clooney version of Batman, but from what you guys are describing, it seems a little bit more shallow.
Oh, Natalie.
And
not,
no,
Natalie.
Yeah. I know, Landry, don't hurt me or anything, but maybe we can do that in the future.
Just picture this in your head. Picture Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze making as many puns about cold weather as you could possibly make in a given 5-minute period. That's basically
Take 2 of these and call me in the morning.
Yes, exactly.
Is my favorite.
I knew the Schwarzenegger impersonation was coming. Oh gosh. But anyway, so
it's
like
not a tumor.
Someone stop him. Okay.
He's here. Arnold Schwarzenegger is in my house with me right now. It's amazing.
Okay, so I don't want to stop our Batman conversation without talking about how great Anne Hathaway is as Catwoman, or Selena is her name in the movie. I just thought she was awesome. I also I have a soft spot for Anne Hathaway, partially just because I love the Princess Diary movies and I always will. But I just thought it was really interesting that she was kind of obviously painted as a, not a sidekick, but her and Batman fought fluidly together. And I just thought it was really interesting how they brought her into the mix in the third movie. And I kind of was wondering what you all think, what she added to the movie, or what was the importance of her character.
I kind of went back and forth on this because one thing Nolan realized after the debacle of Spider-Man 3, I would like to think that he realized this, where you put too many villains into a movie. This also kind of occurred with Batman Forever, and to some extent the Val Kilmer Batman. That with both in The Dark Knight with Harvey Dent, so adding in Two-Face and then adding in Catwoman, but having them not become like a secondary pole, like a POLE, like a pole of villainy where you have to fight both of them, right? And making them be associate characters in some way, I thought effectively introduced her. Now, it's interesting that the fact that she's Catwoman is not necessarily crucial in some sense. Like, I mean, she's a thief, and so I guess that matters. But like, she's her character as Selena Kyle kind of matters more than her being Catwoman. I mean, she has to be able to fight, I guess. But I mean, I think she did a great job. I think she did better than Michelle Pfeiffer, I would say.
Oh my God, I'm leaving the chat.
Well, I like Michelle Pfeiffer's aesthetic more because Tim Burton really put together a great aesthetic on that. But I think that the character is a little bit more rich. But Corey apparently disagrees.
No, I mean,
Corey, go ahead. Tell us your thesis.
I don't want to
your
just
Michelle Pfeiffer thesis.
Oh, I mean, it's kind of related because I think that this was such a grounded take on Catwoman, as Nolan always does, and right, I don't even think she gets called Catwoman. So I think a big thing for her character is, I think like this goes to what Natalie was saying. The Dark Knight Rises is really about Bruce's trauma and depression. And I mean, he's very clearly depressed at the beginning, right? He's living as a hermit, and he really has no will to live, nothing to live for. And this is the most overt any superhero movie has come to really exploring depression, or using the superhero identity as a metaphor for mental illness. The closest you get is the Burton movies, because there it's less depression and more split personality. Batman says to Catwoman in Batman Returns, we're split right down the middle. We're the same. So you have a metaphor for mental illness in those, and I love that about those movies. But in The Dark Knight Rises, you get this even further. And Catwoman, to me, I mean, the whole arc for Bruce is, right, like he has to figure out something to live for. Like, he only sees one end of his journey. Like, that kind of line gets repeated a number of times. And the movie tricks you into thinking that he's going to die. And I mean, maybe you think he dies. Like, we haven't really talked about if the ending is to be interpreted literally. I think it is. I think it's supposed to be a happy ending, that he overcame his depression and that Selena was that new person that that helped him find a will to live. They kiss at the end, and then it seems like that's when he decides, like, oh wait, I guess I maybe have something to live for. I won't die with the bomb. I won't, become a martyr. Well, he becomes a martyr, but I won't really die.
I apologize to all of you, but the correct answer for the best Catwoman is Eartha Kitt. So I'm sorry to tell you how wrong you all are. Though I do love the fact that in the new Batman, the Batman that will come out in a few years, that with Robert Pattinson, that the Catwoman of that is going to be played by Zoe Kravitz, who I think is really interesting. But also, and she voiced her in the Lego Batman movie.
That's even better.
I know. But sadly, number 2 on the list, sort of battling out Zoe Kravitz, is Halle Berry. I don't know if you guys know, but she's the second best Catwoman. I don't know if you guys realize.
Andrew, your deep cuts are getting too deep. Stop.
Never. The cuts are never too deep.
One of the worst movies ever made. Okay, wait, because I know we're kind of running out of time, but we have not talked about the police. And I mean, right now, like these, especially Dark Knight Rises, right? The rioting, the police are as heroes. It's extremely reactionary in the sense of quelling crime and holding the police up as icons. We have a clash at the end, basically a sort of medieval style battle of the police rushing in. It all seemed, for the movie made in 2012 for Dark Knight Rises, I was like, man, this is really relevant. Occupy Wall Street had already happened, the inequality things and returning power to the people and stuff. But in this sort of, turbulent time, It was quite striking to me. And ultimately, Batman is on the side of the cops, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think that goes to the way Nolan viewed the character and like the angle in which he wanted to explore him uniquely, and that, you know, he's the symbol, or he has this ideology essentially, you know, of the rule of law, except, you know, for me sometimes, I don't know.
He's the symbol of order. Like Batman is weirdly the symbol of order.
Well, that's so interesting. The concept of the Batman as a symbol also kind of irked me with what like Ra's al Ghul was saying at the beginning of Batman Begins, which Bruce pounces upon and is like, no, he's right, I can do this, before he sort of realized who Ra's al Ghul like was really about and what his intentions were. Was that he said that, you know, as a man he can be killed, but as a symbol he's incorruptible. And I was like, I don't think that's true. Symbols get corrupted and
Absolutely.
like stuff all the time. They get repurposed and manipulated, and people still try. I mean, and maybe it's the fact that, you know, Batman was able to stop people from corrupting his image. Like, he's able to stop the police from dressing up as him. But they say, like, they said, like, we dress up like Batman and they wear hockey pads because that's a way that they can sort of get people to sort of fear them, because he inspires fear. But I mean, I think anyone who's been involved in a movement will tell you that symbols get corrupted all the time. So I did think it was a little naive of Bruce Wayne to be like, as a symbol, I can be incorruptible.
Totally agree. Yes.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, it was also going back to what Trevor was saying about how police are portrayed, well, throughout the trilogy, but more so, I'm going to focus more so on The Dark Knight Rises, is interesting because at one point, when Bane is like ruling over Gotham, and they have like a tribunal, and they're making all of the former corrupt representatives of the state like go before this tribunal, and then they have to walk across the ice, or they have to go
important thing though, he says this multiple times, Scarecrow, this is not a trial, this is a sentencing, right? That's
right.
Like this, this is not a trial. It's before a tribunal, but it's not trying anything. It's just sentencing them because they're already guilty.
Right, exactly. So I just thought it was interesting because all along the movies are very and Batman himself are very like pro police, in the sense that like police are the ones that are establishing order, and Batman's kind of like helping, like bolstering them almost. I don't know if that's a great word for it, but you know, we're going to go with that. I think that towards the end, definitely in front of that tribunal when they're being sentenced, it's interesting because we had already been revealed that like, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the police commissioner's name, that he had lied and sent all those people to jail. Gordon, there we go. Gordon had already been revealed to have lied to create the Harvey Dent Act and sent all these people to jail, and they'd been in jail for 8 years. And we kind of reveal kind of the bad things that the police have done in the name of like fixing corruption and getting rid of the gangs and all that kind of stuff. And I just thought that whole interaction with like having them go off onto the ice or being sentenced was an interesting way to kind of end that. This towards the end of the third movie, interesting way to end that kind of statement on police. But at the same time, they made, is it Blake? Yeah. They seem to have made Blake, who is a newer police officer, ostensibly be like the one who's continuing on Batman's legacy. And I thought we should definitely talk about Blake before we end our Batman discussion, and also talk about the end of The Dark Knight Rises, because Blake is that young police officer that seems to be learning about Gotham and learning about the intricacies of like the corruption and that kind of stuff, and learning from Bruce Wayne. And in a way, when I was preparing for this podcast, I was reading up some, and Christopher Nolan did not want to put in a Robin, like obviously Batman's like sidekick, but in a way, Blake kind of fills that role. And I was kind of wondering what you thought about like having him being a police officer, having him be the one that's like continuing Batman's legacy in a way. At least that's how I saw the ending.
Well, is it sort of hinting at not that he becomes Batman, but does he become, is that Nighthawk? Is that who that
they
is?
say his name is Robin. There's that, very on the nose, like
Right.
your real name is Robin, like, which is fine. I do want to say, like, so, I mean, just a quick word, as a lawyer who works on criminal justice issues, watching the Harvey Dent Act, I have a general principle that any law named after a person is a bad law. This is especially true if they're a dead kid, like dead kids.
Ooh. Dead
kids make really bad laws. There's a piece that Radley Balco wrote for Reason years ago that like you create this law in a fervor to like fix a problem, and then it ends up. I mean, I think you could do an entire exploration of why the Harvey Dent Act was used, probably illegitimately, like RICO was eventually used to ensnare all these people and put them in prison. Definitely that's true. But with Robin, I mean, it's, I think the Joseph Gordon-Levitt character is really good in that movie. Actually, I think he's a good foil of someone who knew, and he also knew that Bruce Wayne was Batman when he saw him, which is an interesting, like, I think, twist in that.
Yeah, he is called Robin explicitly, so he's kind of this interesting take on the character. I kind of think Nolan's refusal to do any sort of traditional Robin sort of speaks to like the way he sees the character of Batman quite differently. Batman in a lot of ways, I think historically he's supposed to be a kid at heart, right? I mean, he's still a kid who's in the alley afraid, that he lost his parents, and, he's afraid to trust people now and form new relationships because of that. It's a very kind of simple, age-old kind of story. And that's why Robin exists, because he's a kid. He's another kid that Batman can help guide and who's suffering through the same stuff. And, so I think the performance by Joseph Gordon-Levitt's really good. I love that scene where he deduces Batman's identity, which I think Nolan takes from Tim Drake, the third Robin. I think he figures that out. He's one of the more smart Robins. He's sort of an amalgam, Blake, of a lot of the Robins. But on the Dent Act, though, that Trevor, you mentioned, to me, a thing that's so frustrating about The Dark Knight Rises is that plot point seems to get lost in a lot of it. By the end, they don't really come back to the Dent Act or say if are they going to repeal it and come up with something better, or should we just see the cops beat, the rioters, the prisoners, and arrest them, and then, we don't really get a satisfying, to me, conclusion with the Dent Act, which they indicate was not perfect.
And now for the time in the show where we talk about all the other pieces of media that we have been enjoying while we've been on lockdown. This is Locked In. Corey, Trevor, what else have you been occupying your time with?
In quarantine, I've been watching a lot of movies with my wife directed by Yasujiro Ozu. So this is a sort of weird place to take the Batman talk. But Yasujiro Ozu was a Japanese filmmaker in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And he made over 24 films, lots of movies. They're on the Criterion Collection, which is a streaming service. If anyone likes old movies or obscure films, you should look into the Criterion service. It's a really, really convenient streaming service that lets you watch these movies. And they have tons of Ozu's movies. And his movies are they're contextual yet universal in their morals. They're all about mid-century Japan, post-war Japan specifically, and about the slow destruction of the Japanese family, the way that American culture slowly infiltrated Japanese culture and changed it and transformed it in terms of the norms around consumption and work and marriage and relationships. They're really fascinating. They're very slow and quite minimalist, and still he almost never moves the camera. You can almost always tell when it's an Ozu movie by just one clip or a second. He has such a distinct visual style. But we've just been binging a bunch of his movies because they're really quite enjoyable and interesting. So that's, I guess, kind of random and obscure. But if anyone is interested in like old art movies, he's just one to look at.
For me, aside from I mentioned a video game, playing Tony Hawk Pro Skater Remastered 1 and 2, which was like which was like my fingers just going out of the controller and being like, I'm home. But I would say, so somewhat apropos of the conversation today, one of the more striking things that I've read during lockdown has been I'm not going to call it a comic book, it's more of a graphic storytelling thing called My Favorite Thing is Monsters by Emil Ferris. And this is I've never seen anything quite like it. It is told as a notebook. It's a notebook of a teenage girl that she draws in her notebook. She talks about her life and draws pictures and writes things down in her notebook. So the entire thing is presented as if it's a 3-ring or spiral notebook with 3-hole punches in it. And it's not a comic book in the traditional sense of having panels. It's more of a unique work of art that is extremely striking and very evocative. I've never seen anything quite like it, and I think it deserves a lot more attention. I've been reading graphic storytelling in the broadest sense since I was 5 years old, and it was entirely novel to me, and I highly recommend it. My Favorite Thing is Monsters by Emil Ferris.
Cool. I'll have to check that one out. For me, so this weekend I was at home visiting my parents, and we got on this weird tangent of watching the Robin Williams documentary that just came out. The one, I guess, that his wife helped either fund and or do the research for, about discussing Lewy body dementia. And I thought that was really interesting. I'm also, I love basically every movie that Robin Williams was in. Mrs. Doubtfire is one of the most underrated one, but we can cover that movie another time. But I watched that documentary, and then I watched one of the older documentaries about Robin Williams that came out in 2018. So still after he passed away, but it was interesting because it clipped together. It was called Robin Williams Come Inside My Mind, I think. And it clipped together basically all of his best performances before, even before, like when he was a comedian and what hadn't switched over to film or voice acting yet. And I thought it was super interesting, just kind of easy watching. And Robin Williams is a great actor. So I think if you're interested in learning more about his life and different roles, I think both of those movies are very interesting. And they're also very educational in terms of like the disease that he was struggling with. And then other than that, I've been reading a lot. So I finished In Cold Blood, and I just started 5 Years, which is just it's a fiction novel about a woman who has what I think, I'm 100 pages in, what I think is a mental illness, because when she falls asleep, she has these very real life experiences that are 5 years in the future. And so far it's really good because like the chapters go back and forth from when like she's living her life, and then she lives her life 5 years in advance, during the nighttime. So far it's really good. It's a New York Times bestseller. And then after that, I plan to read Man in the High Castle. I'm currently watching the TV show, but I've now been told by like 5 or 6 different people that the book is way better. And usually I try to read the book before I read before I watch a movie and or TV show about it, but I actually didn't know there was a book. So after that, I plan to read The Man in the High Castle, which maybe could be a show we cover on Pop and Lock, but there's also 4 seasons. So that would be a lot of binge watching for a guest.
Well, I have a few things I've been occupying my time with. One of them, I went back and rewatched the first season of, and watched some of the second season of, is the Netflix show American Vandal, which really got slept on, even though I think it is so funny. It seems like it's a simple conceit and that the joke will run out very quickly, but it becomes a very interesting, nuanced story. It's
brilliant.
It's brilliant. If you haven't seen it, it's a sort of spoof of the Making a Murderer style documentary on Netflix. But the crime is that at a high school, a student is suspected and accused of drawing phallic images all over the cars in the teacher parking lot. And it becomes this really hilarious, dry spoof that also is a cool meditation about like criminality and sort of assuming the worst in people, specifically young people. And And while it's hilarious and you'll recognize a lot of the people, they bring an amazing, real sense of emotion to the characters. And if you watch it all the way through to the end, there's some great twists and turns that make it interesting. And it's much more than just what the trailer makes it seem like, even if the trailer itself is very funny. And then the second season is a bit more gross in its premise, so it involves a little bit more bathroom humor. But from what I can tell, it also is sort of in a similar vein, true crime, but set in a high school in a goofy manner. So I highly recommend American Vandal. If you have a PC with Steam or a Nintendo Switch, you should get the game Billion Road. It's not gonna change your world like The Witcher or Outer Worlds, where you go and explore this amazing world. It's basically Mario Party meets Monopoly in Japan. So you go around a little board and you buy properties and you get monsters that help you along the way, and you roll dice and you try and earn lots and lots of money over the years, and you try and have the most money and total assets by the end. But then there's also monsters that come down like goofy, like cartoon kaijus that will come and crush your buildings, and you have to send your monsters to go and fight them. It's very simple. It's a great board game that you can play on your Switch. It's very cute. And I highly recommend Billion Road if that's the kind of thing you're into. My wife and I have been playing it a lot over the past few weeks. And the other thing that if you're interested in games or writing, it's sold as a game, but it's really a book of writing prompts. It is a book called 1,000-Year-Old Vampire by Tim Hutchings. And it is a single-player role-playing game where you roll and basically get a bunch of writing prompts that help you write in the diary of a vampire that has lived for at least 1,000 years. And you sort of detail events in this vampire's life and people that it has met, and things that drive it. And it's just a really interesting way to sort of force yourself to world build, or if you want to sort of put something with a screen down, you could either write it by hand or open up just a Word document. And it's just enough structure to make you feel like you're not completely lost, but just open enough to make you feel like you can really go anywhere with it. So if you like that kind of thing and want a new creative outlet or a sort of thing to sort of spend your time doing away from the screen, I highly recommend 1,000-Year-Old Vampire. Holy credits, Batman! Thanks for listening. If you think the Batman is just some rich guy in spandex who thinks he could take justice into his own hands, or if you have another hero in mind you think could take him down, let us know on Twitter at PopandLockPod. That's Pop, the letter N, Lock with an E, Pod. Make sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. We look forward to unraveling your favorite show or movie next time. Pop and Lock is produced by me, Landry Ayers, as a project of libertarianism.org. To learn more, visit us on the web at www.libertarianism.org.